we're really pleased that you could join us today. I think this is going to be a good program. We're going to keep it informal. This is the kind of thing where I think it really makes a lot of sense to have some interaction, because there's a lot of information and misinformation about some of the stuff we're going to talk about, and I'm convinced that by the end of the program, I think you all have at least one or two things to take back and be able to, implement at your company. Real pleased to have Mark Hanrahan with us again today. Mark's a principal at a firm here in Cumberland. He's been a contractor in his past life before he became an attorney, and he's practiced construction law for a couple of decades. He knows construction from both sides of the fence. He's also represented both owners and contractors. And a lot of what we're going to talk about today is we understand there's two sides to this equation, so we're not really taking a hard position. We're going to explain what the issues are and what to be mindful of. And our goal is to educate our client, whether a prime or a sub, and just have them have the tools to make good business decisions when they're in negotiations over contracts or bond forms or SDI or whatever the case may be, which we're going to cover all those things to some degree today. Just by note of clarification, the invitation said payment and performance bonds, and we're really going to focus on the performance bond side of it. If that's a disappointment, let us know. We could do a program on payment bonds, but there's a lot of material available on payment bonds through construction associations. We see regular, programs on lien laws and the payment bond side of the equation, and a lot less material on this side. And so when we were talking with each other about what would make sense and what would be interesting to our group, we said, let's focus on the performance side. But that's not to say we can't answer questions or handle things offline. I think I had enough handouts. If you don't have everything, and I didn't print every page of some of them, so just to save some paper, I'm happy to email any of this stuff to you. It's all available via email. With that, Mark's going to start, and then we'll probably ham and egg it a little bit as we go, and then I've got a section that I'll cover formally as well. With that, thank you.
Thank you, Doug. Thank you for coming today. I think we have a really informative and helpful program. And as Doug said, we're going to focus on performance bonds. And I know that many of you are familiar or quite familiar with performance bonds, but I'm going to go through some basics real quick so that we're all on the same page about what a bond is, who the parties are, who the responsibilities are, all the basics, and then we'll get to later talking about some real specific stuff about the bond forms themselves. What are the best practices for declaring a default, invoking surety obligations under a bond, and if you happen to get a notice of default, how you should react to that, and what are your responsibilities to surety, and if you're not obligee. So we'll try to take all of that through today. So just from the very start of things, well, what is a surety bond? Well, it is an agreement by which a surety guarantees the performance of its principal under a contract or the obligation stated in the bond. Oops. I knew I'd do that. The parties are the principal, the obligee, and the surety. The principal is the entity on the bond who has the performance obligation. The obligee is the entity to which the performance is owed, and the surety guarantees the performance. So, as Doug said earlier, we have a number of different people in the room. We have owners, contractors, and subcontractors in the room. And owners are going to be principals, and subcontractors are almost always going to be obligees unless you have a sub-subcontractor. But contractors can actually be either obligees or principals. So keep that in mind as we're going on. I think I said subcontractors.
I think you reversed them.
Yeah. Subcontractors will always be principals, and owners will always be obligees, and contractors, general contractors, can be either obligees, or principals. So if you think about the line of contractual privity, you have owners engaging contractors, contractors engaging subcontractors. We're going to be talking about the differing interests that all the stakeholders have in a project and in bonds on the project. Here's a quick look at kind of the relationship graphically. And so let's distinguish between what a performance bond is and what a payment bond is. A performance bond guarantees the principal's obligation under the contract, performance obligation of the contract to the obligee. And the payment bond guarantees the principal's obligation to pay its subcontractors, vendors, and protects the subcontractors and vendors in the form of giving them payment security, while at the same time protecting the owner of the project from claims for non-payment. You often see payment bonds on public construction projects that require them because of public construction projects. There is no mechanics lien rights for the contractor or the subcontractor. And so that's why you see a payment bond required on those projects. And then on private projects, you'll also see them as well, but not as often. So the question often comes up, isn't a payment bond or a performance bond or a surety bond itself, isn't that insurance? Well, no, it's not. It's not insurance because, as I said before, a bond, performance bond, guarantees a principal's performance of the stated obligation in the bond. Now, we'll talk about this later a little bit, but almost all performance bonds in the construction context incorporate the underlying contract. So the bond terms include the construction contract terms, and depending on, we'll get to this as well, depending on the language of the bond, it will either guarantee the performance of the entire obligation under the contract, or perhaps limited obligations under the contract, like performance of the work itself, and we'll talk about that.
Another differentiator on this, if you think about it, is in a bond obligation, there's an indemnity agreement. So the principal guarantees the surety, the insurance company, against loss. That's really sort of the underlying key to the difference, right? If you buy fire insurance, you pay the insurance company a premium for taking the risk of your building will burn down. You don't sign a separate agreement with them on the backside saying, I'll guarantee you against that loss, which you do in surety. And that's really the difference. In insurance, you're buying the risk transfer, and in surety, you've got three parties to the arrangement, and the owner's the only one that's getting the obligee under the bond's getting the protection. It does not leave the principal's responsibility.
And as Doug said, the policy of insurance indemnifies the insured from loss, physical loss to property or person related to third-party claims. Another important distinction with surety bonds is that there'll be a general indemnity agreement that the principal signs, or somebody on behalf of the principal will sign, and that under that general indemnity agreement, if the surety incurs loss under the bond, they will seek indemnity from that indemnitor for any of its losses. So, and that is a very big difference between an insurance product and a surety bond. So those are sort of the basics to keep in mind as we go through this today. And also, I think it's really important to keep in mind the typical chain of contractual privity, and each of you in the room are going to occupy a specific place in that chain. But it's also helpful to understand perhaps your counterparty's stake in the project, to understand how they may be thinking about the duties and obligations that are created under a bond, performance bond. So I'm going to turn it over to Doug. Doug's going to talk about subcontractor default insurance as an alternative to bonding.
So this topic gets mixed up with bonding by its nature. The solution for performance guarantees through 1995 was bonding. If you were a GC, you wanted the protection against your sub's default, you bought a bond. In 1995, Zurich Insurance Company invented a product called sub-default insurance. Their brand name is SubGuard. You probably have, how many of y'all have been enrolled in one of those programs? Been several. It's essentially it's an insurance product that was meant to insure the default risk of the subs rather than relying on a surety company for that protection. The basic reason, the history of that is that there was a lot of frustration, particularly at the highest levels of contractor size. So what you otherwise would know as the ENR 400 size contractors, when they would have a sub default on a project, and they would chase the surety for protection. That depending on the form, and we're going to talk about the forms and why they're so important to this structure. That process almost inevitably slowed the project down, results in delays, and a lot of these guys are building, big office buildings, stadiums, treatment plants, very schedule intensive, and so there was a lot of frustration among that group with the available option, which was bonding. And so bonding, a big issue with it in terms of quick response is that it's been around 100+ years, and there's 100+ years of case law and because it's a third-party protection, there's been a lot of litigation around it. And so there's been, a whole body of case law that governs the responsibilities and the duties of the parties involved. And this product is a first-party product. So you get away from that issue. This is an indemnity product. In other words, if I'm a GC and I buy this and I'm sub-defaulted, I terminate them, I notify the surety company, I resolve the default. So whether I fund them out of the pocket or I hire somebody new at a premium, I'm going to resolve the claim. And then I turn around and submit the claim to the carrier and get reimbursed. Okay? The idea being, I have the control of the process. I don't have to sue somebody, particularly an insurance company who's got lots of resources and lots of attorneys and can delay and stall and all those kind of things. I'm the one that's best in a position to resolve the claim efficiently. So in other words, it's kind of like a blanket surety bond. And it's set up like an insurance policy. So there's a lot of confusion between these two. We said surety is not insurance. This is insurance. Okay? We are transferring the risk to the insurer above our deductible, which we'll get into on a subsequent slide. First party, it's like your fire policy. Your building burns, you get a check from the insurance company. If you have a claim here, you go and get the money from the insurance company. You're responsible for declaring and managing the defaults. There is a substantial deductible involved. And a copay layer, which is kind of like what you're used to hearing about in health insurance, all right? You got a deductible, $2,500, and then you've got a layer where you're responsible for 10% of the next, up to say $3,000 out of pocket, and then you're fully insured. This works basically the same way, except the deductibles are a minimum of $250,000. And typically on the biggest guys, they can be $1 million to $2 million. So the GC, the guys who buy this product, the companies that buy this product, has a lot of skin in the game, which the companies who are properly administering this turn into underwriting entities if they're doing this right? They've got a whole team of people. You're submitting pre-qualification information, you're submitting updates and backlog reports and all that, just like you do your surety. Well, the reason is those guys have a lot of skin in the game, and that's by design so that the insurance company doesn't get selected against, because otherwise, if if you could just buy 100% coverage, there'd be a tendency to say, oh, I don't care that this guy's 20% low, I'm gonna take this number and I'm putting it in the SubGuard and I'll get it out of the policy if he blows up. Well, that would, this is a form of credit extension, that would not be a good outcome long-term for the carrier. The warranty available under this product is longer typically than what a bond traditionally offers. So it's as little as 5 years on some of the policies. It's as great as 10 years. So Zurich originally had a 10-year warranty cover built into their product. They've since realized that was very difficult to deal with because they've experienced a lot of construction defect in later years in those policies. And if you've been hearing scuttlebutt on the street, they cut their tail back. Basically they cut it to the warranty or 5 years, whichever is less. So they basically backed it all the way up to what a bond traditionally is, which is a guarantee through the warranty period. Well, guess what? Their clients weren't that happy about that. And so you guys may be familiar that a lot of these programs have moved from Zurich because there's another player in the market, Excel Insurance, that essentially kept Zurich's original terms and conditions, and they have picked up some of these giant SubGuard programs. So in town, I'm aware of Holder and Brassfield having moved their programs from Zurich to Excel. And if you went through that pre-qual and you saw a different company, that's some of the backstory on it. And unfortunately, they don't publish their loss results on this product, so it's really anecdotal what we hear about and what you see happening in the market, that that there's been loss activity on it. Just like a insurance policy, this can also be premium financed. So that's different from a bond too. You typically don't get financing on a bond. This is just sort of what the structure looks like, okay? Surety coverage, you generally are getting at or close to 100% coverage, depending on the form and if you change ordered and if the change orders are included in the contract, in the bond value, you would get 100% coverage. In the SDI program, we talked about this deductible layer and then a percentage of copay, and then up here you get full coverage after that. The cost on this, just to give you an idea, one of the reasons that people have talked about it being a profit center to these general contractors is that because of, if you think about it, they're buying a product with a huge deductible. This is not unlike if you went into a large deductible on your workers' comp or your GL. You take a $250,000 workers' comp deductible, your premium goes way down because your carrier is only responsible above that 250 layer. Well, the same idea applies here. This product's got a big deductible on it, so the carrier's way up above whatever that is, 250, $1 million, $2 million. So the cost of that, what we call the risk transfer premium, the part up here that goes 100% to the carrier, that is a fraction of what a traditional bond cost is. So if you say a bond is 1.25%, this costs 0.3 to 0.6% to buy that insurance. And then they put money into the policy in the form of a premium that basically provides a loss fund. And but that's their money, essentially. So they're showing an owner on the other side of this a policy that's got a rate on it of this to this, and they're putting this in a loss fund bucket. And when they have a loss, theoretically they have that funding to go get reimbursement for it. Does that make sense? I know I'm going kind of fast. We got a limited amount of time. Advantages: GC's in control of the claim. Another advantage is, and we're going to talk about this in the context of bond forms themselves, right? There's a whole bunch of bond forms that are out in the marketplace. AIA's got them, Consensus Docs has them, every GC in town has their own one. There's thousands of them, an unlimited number. You can edit a new one today, right? In this type of program, you've got one policy, you know what the terms and conditions are, you're protected uniformly across your sub portfolio. That's a definite advantage. You got the longer warranty provisions, and then if you have good performance, this is another concept, okay? The profit center idea. If the GC does a good job pre-qualifying, and only puts quality subcontractors in that program, they're not gonna spend that loss fund, right? I'll show you some, well, I don't have a chart on this, but the current loss ratio in surety through June is about 18%. That's really good right now. And if you as a GC can run 18% loss ratio on this policy, you will make some money. If you're charging it out at 1 to 1.25%, and you're only having 18 points above your risk transfer premium, that money accrues to you, and you have basically a fund building up to pay losses. The risks, the downside coverage comes with a big deductible. There's no third-party checking. This is all your responsibility. So you're seeing infrastructure develop at these big GCs for doing this, and that's part of all y'all are uploading information and making you keep them current on everything. That's part of that. And then, of course, it's an insurance policy, so there is, there's a per subcontract and an aggregate limit. And generally, if you design it properly, you're going to be fine with that. This is not unlike when you make a decision on buying an umbrella. What's the magic number for your company? I don't know what it is, but you can look at your business and come up with something that probably makes sense. Same thing here. Yes, it's going to have a limit on it, though, just like your other policies do. What's happening in the marketplace? It's not going away. This is something that my surety brethren back in '95, there was all kinds of gnashing of teeth, and people didn't want this product to be in the markets, stealing our sub bond premium and all that. It's not going away. So there's 3 carriers that are doing it. They're all A+ rated. They're all very strong, and all indications are they're going to stay in the business. Which is good for buyers, because Zurich did not have competition until 2010. So 1995 to 2010, and they were only game in town. They set minimum limits. They dictated terms and conditions. They had annual premiums, whether you use the policy or not. That's all changed too. Arch and XL are the other 2 carriers. The interesting thing to watch is XL stepping into their shoes and taking all these programs without changing the terms and conditions. Because if you think about it from an insurance geek perspective, Zurich didn't want them anymore on those terms. New carrier comes in, takes them all on the same basis. Well, 5 years from now, we'll see if that was a good bet. We talked about some of this. The one good thing that we're seeing, and this is one of the attachments in your package, is they're finally, after however many, it's 21 years of this product being in the market, the surety industry is starting to sort of adapt a little bit in terms of alternative product offerings. Some of the big carriers, XL and Travelers most notably, have come out with something they call an expedited default resolution bond. And I don't have the whole document in the packet, but I've got the resolution part of it, which is kind of the big key to it, and I can email you the whole thing, it's not a problem. And we're actually probably going to have a program just on this sometime in the coming days, because this is sort of a hot topic. But the idea behind this is that the sureties have recognized that the buyers out there don't want to have to sue them, they don't want to have to fight, they don't want to lose their schedule when there's a default. They want to be able to declare a default and get paid. And the surety companies have adapted a little bit where they're creating this bond form that says, all right, if you declare a default, we have an expedited arbitration process, and we'll make it. They assure deadlines, and if it holds up in arbitration, there's a payment made. And it's probably going to be a percentage. It's probably not going to be a full payout on the bond, but that's a huge sea change in the business, because that's not the current environment for surety claims. Any questions on any of that? I know I covered it pretty fast.
So let me make one point to the owners in the room. You notice that Doug was talking about the insured is the general contractor and an insured subcontractor default. Owners are not going to get under these policies any performance insurance for the general contractor's performance. And so remember that for the owners in the room, if your general contractor is offering up SDI, that the risk is that's being insured is the risk of a subcontractor default, not a contractor default. Now that does provide owners some security, because what happens in a subcontractor default, a major subcontractor default is much more likely on a project than a general contractor default. And so it insures that risk, and it ensures that a major subcontractor default is not going to completely derail your project and have your project cave in. But that insurance product does not insure a default by the contractor.
So that has to be provided for separately.
Yeah, and I understand there's an endorsement in there.
One of the carriers has come out with an endorsement to include the GC, so that's in the evolution right now. But a lot of times, they'll still get a bond on the GC, even though there's a SubGuard program underneath it for that reason. Or because it's legislatively dictated if it's a public job or whatever. Does that make sense?
Doug, on this new expediting bond kind of deal, what's the cost of it?
Yeah, you put me on the spot. I don't know. I mean, it's so new that we just literally got that form recently. I mean, it's been used in very limited context to date. But you don't get to talk about many changes in my business, so I thought it would be worth noting, and look for more on that. Though we will have a future program where we'll get into the details of that. Travelers is one of the purveyors of it, and they've indicated they'd be happy to do a program for us. Wanted to talk briefly before getting into some of the technical side of bond forms and why they're important and the different provisions. I want to talk just a little bit about what's going on in the surety marketplace itself right now. The growth in premium has been almost zero since 2008. So when the crash happened, there was a big drop off, and we're just getting back to that level of premium. I suspect that one of the reasons that it's still sort of lagging is that the federal market, other than the stimulus, has been relatively dead. And that's a lot of bond volume when you think about it, because the public entities are bound, federal work is obligated by the Miller Act to require bonds. And so when that portion of the construction market goes down, there's less aggregate premium coming through the industry. We're seeing just an incredible amount of new sureties coming to the market. These are just, I'm sure this list is not complete. But the interesting thing, I mean, some of these are fairly small companies, or they're regional companies that are, have been insurers for a long time, but they got into the surety product recently. But there's a couple whoppers on here. I mean, Berkshire Hathaway, everybody knows who that is. That's Warren Buffett's company. They were never in the retail surety business up until about 2 years ago. So that's kind of a big deal, because they have a ginormous balance sheet. They're the biggest insurance company in the world, and they just got into the retail surety business. Now they're operating sort of on the upper end, but that's still a big sea change kind of thing. And Philadelphia Insurance Company just got into the surety business about 3 years ago. They're owned by Tokyo Fire and Marine. Tokyo is like the third largest insurance company in the world. So there's what we say is this is a heck of a lot of capital coming to the business. And what it has generally meant is that there is a supercharged amount of interest in what we would call the small to middle market, or lower upper market, I guess. I mean, the $1 million bond and the $100 million program, there's just more carriers than we've ever seen before. And that's a good thing for most of the people in this group, because that means there's a governor on their ability to tighten your terms and conditions. And I think, when you're renegotiating your terms with your annual statements and reviews by your sureties, this is good information to have. There's a lot of people interested in your surety business, by a factor of, I don't know, a couple at least. I mean, this is just a heck of a lot of new entrants in a very short period of time. Any questions on any of that? But several of these companies are quite large. The other thing that we're seeing too is behind the scenes on this is there's a lot of hedge funds getting into reinsurance. Like Reinsurance, which is the insurers behind the insurance companies, that also drives pricing and terms and conditions down. If there's too much capital in that end of the market, that filters down into the retail market where we are, where these guys are. And that has just changed in the last 10 years incredibly. In fact, some of these insurance companies basically were started by hedge funds or private equity groups. So there's just a lot of, with the zero interest rate environment, there's a lot of capital in this business. Let's see. The other thing, this was just in the paper the other day. I don't know if y'all read the Wall Street Journal, but there was a front page article on these things called cat bonds, where they are selling debt instruments into the bond market to guarantee against catastrophe losses. So big hurricanes and things like that. And that has absorbed 12% of the capital in the reinsurance market in about a 10-year period, which is just a huge move in a short period of time. And that, again, sort of pushes down the surety's ability to negotiate tough terms and conditions. The one thing we're going to be watching is that there's a whole cottage industry in the surety business of guaranteeing mine reclamation, which y'all wouldn't know about this. It's not construction bonds, but there's a lot of guarantees out there that say when you're done with this coal mine, you got to put it back, and you got to plant trees, and you got to fill it back in. Well, I think every major coal company in the United States has filed bankruptcy or is teetering on the brink. And one of our underwriters did an analysis last year of how much exposure that is to the market. And I don't think it'll be an Enron event, which really rocked the surety market when Enron blew up. There was a lot of bond exposure out there. But this coal, running the coal companies out of business could be interesting down the road. Look for more on that. Any questions about that? That was kind of quick. Anything on your individual situations? We represent most of these guys that are in the market, so we're pretty familiar with all the players and do a lot of surety business straight up. So with that,
there are probably as many types of bond forms in the marketplace as humanly imaginable. Any lawyer wants to get exercise his or her imagination and start drafting a bond form can draft a bond form. So there are all kinds of forms out there, and they're drafted to benefit whatever place that stakeholder, the obligee, that stakeholder occupies in the chain of contractual privity we're talking about. So it is critically important that when you enter into a contract that you're going to have a performance bond that's going to guarantee your performance, or you're going to ask the surety to guarantee somebody else's performance, that you get the bond form you want. The terms of the bond are going to govern, and the bonds in the construction industry incorporate the underlying contract. So based on the terms of the bond, it will guarantee the incorporated contract. An important precept in the interpretation world is that the obligation of the surety will not be extended beyond the bond by implication. Now, you may have heard that the surety's obligation of the bond is strictly construed, and in some instances it is, but when you have a compensated surety, the rule is, and particularly in Georgia, that it won't be extended by implication. So whatever the four corners of that document says, that's their obligation. And so this is a really important aspect of bond form selection, and an example of how important this is to think about the underlying obligation that's guaranteed. Some obligations or some bonds will ensure the performance of the entire contractual obligation, and that can include indemnity obligations, warranty obligations, other performance obligations other than strictly performing the work. Other bond forms are just going to require performance of the work, where the surety comes in and performs the work only. So here again, talking about the chain of contractual privity, If you're an owner entity, you're probably going to want, as an obligee, you're going to want the entire obligation of the underlying contract bonded and guaranteed. In that same scenario, if you're the contractor or subcontractor as a principal, you're probably not going to want the scope of the guarantee to extend to the full obligation. You might want it to extend only to performance of the work. And we'll talk about that more, but that's just an example of...
Another example would be if you're in a trade where, you know, long-term warranties are sort of common. If not managed, you know, and you just write a bond on that contract and it's got a 5-year warranty in it, the surety obligation is going to extend to that. Sureties are very leery of long-tail obligations, so that's why they're asking for your subcontract and drilling down into that kind of provision. And things like that can be carved out and addressed. So the surety may say by agreement with you, look, we're comfortable covering 2 years or 3 years, but we don't want 5. 3's our outer limit. Well, then you could either amend the contract or amend the bond form and carve out that additional warranty period in the bond form.
So, again, talking about the different forms of bonds, there are really 2 broad categories and various hybrids of this stuff. But there's a performance bond, a set of performance bonds. We're going to talk about that, and we're going to talk about indemnity bonds. And in your packet, I've included the AAA form A12 as an example of a performance bond. We're going to start with a performance bond and then turn to the indemnity bonds. And so I think it's probably the last one in the packet.
One says AIA, top is the red.
I apologize for all this language on this slide, but the language is important, but that's why I included the bond form in your package so you can look at it rather than strain your eyes to look at this. But under the AIA form, which is a performance bond form, you'll notice that under Section 3, the surety's obligation under this bond shall arise after. And then there are numerous conditions here which include notice of considering to declare a default, a possible conference in 10 days after such a notice that the contractor is considering declaring a default. The surety, if the owner does not or the obligee does not request a conference, the surety can request it, and then the contractor or the obligee must declare default, terminate the contract, and agree to pay the underlying contract balance to the surety. So here are a whole bunch of obligations of the obligee before it can trigger the surety's obligation under the bond. So if we think back again about our chain of contractual privity, this is certainly a bond that a principal favors a principal because it requires a lot of action by an obligee before it triggers the surety's obligations. Now, one thing I skipped over, I want to make sure that I talk about when we talk about the importance of the bond form and paying attention to it, is that, and it incorporates the underlying contract. Well, if you're not careful about these kinds of conditions here that talk about time periods and notices and all of that stuff, you're going to have obligations in your contract that set forth certain notice provisions for default. You might have a 2-stage default notice provision where you give an initial notice and then a secondary notice and all that stuff. Well, it may conflict with these obligations. And so when you call me up and say, Mark, we've got this big problem on our project, and we want to talk about this kind of stuff, and I said, well, first thing I'm going to say to you is send me the contract, send me the bonds, let me look at it. Well, I look at it and go, oh boy, we got differing notice requirements and differing notice periods, and so we're going to have to undertake some time to figure out how we can best comply. We might not be able to fully comply, and that may be a problem. But getting back to this bond form again, and talking about these provisions, well, then it's important to look at item 2, and the next item here that is required to trigger the surety's obligation is declare a default, terminate the contract, notify the surety. Very, very important language. And if you're
And frankly, very misunderstood. Folks try to enforce a default. A lot of times they're not aware, they've got to go through this process, and that's a very formal, step-by-step. You don't just do it. It's got to be either dictated by the contractor here, and the surety, in many cases, I mean, that's their defense. I mean, they're going to basically say, well, you know, we don't have a role yet. You haven't declared them a default. You haven't terminated them.
And that's exactly right. When you are an obligee and you have this bond form and you have a principal that's not performing, and you start sending letters to the surety and say, my principal's not performing, delaying my project, performing defective work, whatever it might be. The surety says, well, that's sort of interesting. Call us when you terminate the contract. Seriously, that's what the answer you're going to get.
I mean, in practice, on our side of it, they do tend to react to that, but it's a very tepid reaction. I mean, if you're relying on that kind of a approach to get the surety engaged, it's generally not going to work.
And behind the scenes, what happens is the surety picks up the phone, calls the principal, and says, "Hey, what's going on?" And the principal says, "Well, the obligee, they're not doing their work, and they got a crazy project manager or owner, and he's over inspecting our work. He's over enforcing the contract, whatever." And so the surety, who's the principal is their customer, say, "Okay, well, let us know." He calls back the obligee and says, "Well, when you terminate the principal, let me know." The next, if you get through this part of the process, and we're going to talk about the best practices of when a default occurs, or declaring default, or when you get a default notice. We'll talk about that in a few minutes too. But the last item is, agreeing to pay the surety the contract balance, or the contract price that's been unexpended at the time of termination. And so it's somewhere during the course of the project, if you go through this and decide to terminate the project, surety's going to say, well, we're entitled to the contract balance, which they are, but it doesn't say how you pay it here, in which you would pay it as progress payments, just as like a contractor would bill during the course of the project. You don't stroke a check for the whole thing. At least if you called me and asked what you would do, I would say you're not going to do it this way. Assuming that you go through all these steps, then the surety has options, and that's going to be, if you look at section 5 in the bond, the surety can take the following 4 actions. It can arrange for another contractor to perform and enter into a contract with the owner, and that's the owner's consent is required there, and that would require bidding and scope development, all kinds of stuff like that. Perform the contract itself, obtain other contractors. This is where they would obtain other contractors to contract with the owner. This would be arranged for another contractor to perform the project. And then they can waive their rights to perform altogether determine liability and pay the owner, or deny liability in whole and part, and put the contractor or the obligee on its own. So if you go through this whole process, what happens? Well, guess what happens? Lots of time expires. So you go through all the surety options, and if you look at item 6 on the bond, it says, if the surety doesn't proceed with reasonable promptness, surety is deemed to default after 7 days written notice demanding surety's performance. So based on that language, the surety has a reasonable period of time to investigate and to make its decision about what option it's going to exercise. Well, guess what happens when you're the obligee and you've gone through all of this with your principal? You're jumping up and down saying, my project is sitting here wasting away. Your schedule is cratered. You have, if it's a general, all the subcontractors are in complete disarray. If it's a major subcontractor, you've lost control of the sequence of your work, and you've lost control of the project in other ways. And so, this process, my experience with this is, and I've been at every point along the line here representing clients in all kinds of termination and default situations. Under this bond, this getting to surety exercising its options is at least 60 days. 60 days. So if you have a project sit for 60 days, imagine what happens to you if you lose a major subcontractor, or if you're an owner, you lose a general. So as an obligee, you do not want to have this bond. And so, and that would be the owners in the room and the generals in the room who are generals who are engaging a subcontractor under a bond. You're going to want a different bond form that is not going to have all of these conditions preceding. They're not technically conditions preceding, but they're conditions to invoking the surety's obligation. Now, for principals in the room who are general contractors engaged by an owner, or subcontractors engaged by a general contractor, this is exactly the kind of bond you want. And I guess it's obvious why you want it. One, it gives you time to recover. And when we talk about the default best practices, we're going to talk about, engaging and communicating and stuff like that. But if you look back, or you think back to Section 3 here, they should say send a notice that you're considering declaring default and having a meeting with the surety. Well, if you're a principal, this is a golden opportunity. You get this letter, and you say, okay, your executives in your company say, okay, let's get the project management team together and talk about what's going on here. Because it's never black and white. Rarely is it black and white, unless you have some kind of financial collapse or something like that. There are always shades of gray. And so you're going to have to work through these kinds of things. So it gives you a chance to recover. And it also, when an obligee looks at this stuff, a lot of times an obligee had taken this bond and they think, I have plenty of clients who just take a bond. It's a bond, right? It's a bond. Here's my bond. Okay. Well, they don't know what it says. Well, when finally somebody says what's required, there's a considerable disincentive, given the timeline that's involved in getting to a new contractor, to exercising their rights under this bond. And so, even though in a situation where somebody's looking at these bonds and talking about sending these notices about, we're considering declaring a default or declaring a default, at this stage, the relationships on the project are a mess. people are really angry with one another. There's lots of strained relationships. And but even in light of that, there's an opportunity to recover those relationships, to recover your ability to perform. Okay, so we're going to talk about the indemnity bond. The indemnity bond form, and there's, again, a zillion different indemnity bond forms. This is a bond form that I've used in the past. And again, I apologize for
It's the one that looks like this.
The
It's got a
text
little box
on
in the upper right.
no.
Well,
This one.
There's one.
Yeah, there's several indemnity bond forms in there, but
Yeah.
this is one that I've used in the past. Some of the things to notice on this bond form is the scope of the obligation bonded is any obligation, guarantee, or warranty required under said contract. So it bonds the entire obligation. And it goes on, it has some more detail about that. And then the obligation of the surety is to indemnify and save harmless the obligee of and from any and all loss, damage, expense, including costs and attorney's fees, which is extremely important in the face of your bond if you're an obligee. Sustained by the obligee by reason of the principal's failure to perform the obligation that's guaranteed. So, that's the obligation. But also notice that there are no time frames. There are no steps for invoking the surety's obligation other than declaring a default. And that's just because the declaration of default will be required under the underlying contract. And the key element of this is no requirement to terminate. So you can invoke, again, this is a good bond form for the obligees in the room, owners engaging general contractors, or general contractors engaging a subcontractor, where if you have a default of your principal on the underlying obligation, you can invoke the surety's obligation to indemnify you by simply giving notice. You don't have to terminate.
There's another form in your packet that does have a little box on the right. This is another indemnity form that's commonly used in this market, and it also does not have a default requirement in it, but it goes another step and has a 10-day response time written in for the surety to start, and it works. We've seen this. One of the flip sides to market, because we do have a lot of subs in here, is that, a negotiating point for you as a subcontractor, and a reasonable place to start, I think, is to require, is to get a default requirement put back in.
Or a termination requirement.
Right. Without it, I mean, this is a really one-sided deal, and this one with a 10-day window, your surety's not going to like that if they read it. But again, in common practice, I mean, that's a point of negotiation.
And this is a really important point Doug is making, because remember we talked about earlier when we were talking about the AIA bond, I said that the surety has a reasonable period of time to investigate and to act. Well, that's stated in the face of the bond, in that particular bond. But it's also a general requirement under surety law. So even though this bond is silent on that point, it doesn't have anything in here that says that the surety is going to have a reasonable time to investigate. It's implied. It's part of the deal. And so a weakness of this bond form is that there is not a timeline for the surety to act. So as an owner, you might not get the indemnity, the performance of the indemnity obligation until they conduct, their investigation and make a determination whether they're going to, in fact, indemnify you, or if they're going to deny liability under the bond. Now, the important point about that is, that doesn't prevent you as an obligee from going ahead and doing what you need to do to cure the default. So you don't have to wait 10 days for a notice. You don't have to send a notice and say 10 days, we're considering declaring default. Another 10 days for 7 days for declaring a default. Another 7 days for termination, or however these periods of time stack up. They stack up a lot and they really harm projects. This allows you as an obligee to get after it. And that if the surety does not undertake its obligation to perform, the only thing that you are going to incur is you're going to upfront the money. And if the surety, and that might be even if, as a practical matter, that may be in fact the case, even if the surety says it will undertake its indemnity obligation. So I'm going to move on and talk about best practices in default. But before I go and get into that, talk about that, does anybody have any questions about the bond forms that we just talked about? Or
One other provision that we didn't highlight that's also commonly addressed going from the AIA form to the indemnity form is the AIA form, and a lot of industry standard forms will have a 2-year suit
Right.
window in it. So suit has to be filed under the bond within 2 years. All these indemnity forms eliminate that.
right?
That's an artificial cutoff of the bond, particularly if you've got a longer term of completion than 2 years to begin with, right? So that's a common, you'll see that gone in the indemnity forms in your packet.
And so what that means is you have until the expiration of the statute of limitations to bring a lawsuit against the surety for recovery. And and I'll say this too, more often than not, what a surety bond is, or a performance bond is, except in the clearest cases of default, all it ensures you really is to have a viable, financially viable defendant to seek recovery for your claim. Where you have a clear default, where you have a financial collapse of a player, the principal, then you're not going to get much of a pushback from the surety on that. But if there is a situation which is very common in the construction industry, where you have mixed causation of problems that lead to a default, then the surety is going to either deny liability or issue a reservation of rights letter or something like that, and step back and let you perform the work and then come after them later on after the work is done. So let's talk about default best practices and what happens on projects. And we're going to start with, from an obligee's perspective, declaring default. What goes into and what obligees should be thinking about when they're considering declaring default. You need to be considering what the terms of the bond are and what the terms of the incorporated underlying contract are. Extremely important. And first step is reconcile those terms. Make sure you understand what if they're conflicting terms or ambiguous terms. But you'll be considering whether there's a material breach, whether there's amounting to a default, giving notice of default, and possible termination. So, does the material breach exist? Well, what is a material breach? It is a breach of a principal or primary obligation under the contract that defeats the purpose of the contract. So it would defeat somebody's benefit of their bargain. It frustrates the purpose or eliminates the purpose of the contract. And so careful analysis is required on that aspect of the decision-making process. Now, when you're in the construction industry, what are the most important aspects of a construction project? What are the principal, or what are the events that have the biggest opportunity to defeat the underlying purpose or benefit of the person's bargain? Well, overruns in costs, delays to the project, overruns in time. They're the two big ones, right? If you have massive schedule delays, you have massive cost overruns, that's going to defeat or frustrate the underlying purpose of the contract. So, careful analysis is required to make sure that that a material breach exists. And as I said before, this is often not a very clear aspect or a clear set of circumstances. There's lots of shades of gray, and when you're, as an obligee, making this decision, you have to consider your own performance. If, let's say, for example, you're considering project delays, well, what a primary part of that analysis is, what have we done to contribute to any delay of the project? If you're an owner, has our design professional delayed the return of shop drawings? Are our contract documents adequate? Are there other problems on the project that we're responsible for that may have contributed to the delay? And if we did contribute to the delay, are those delays to activities on the critical path? They may be side activities, but those are all issues that are just going to cloud the analysis and cloud the argument. But if you reach the decision that your principal has materially breached the contract, then you have to give notice of default. Now, it's important to remember that a material breach, this is a mirror image of what I said a minute ago, a material breach, it is not a technical breach. It's not some breach of some aspect of the contract that doesn't defeat the underlying purpose of the contract. And so if you can recover in damages for some minor breach or non-material breach, that's what you recover, and you do not terminate a contract or start giving notices of default for that. You can, but it's going to lead to trouble. So if you decide there's been a material breach, then you look at your contract and bond form to say, what notice requirements do we have? And again, when I counsel clients in these situations, the first thing I say is, we have to comply with the contract formalities, the bond formalities, every step of the way. So if we have an AIA form that we're just looking at, and I have an obligee come to me and say, I have a problem with my principal, I want to invoke my rights under the contract, and my project's in shambles and we're off schedule and costs are overrunning, I look at the bond and say, well, we've got to give a notice that we're considering declaring a default. And my client's going to say, well, I don't have time for that. I mean, my project's 60 days delayed and I'm going to lose tenants. All kinds of different problems. I have equipment coming here and the project's not going to be ready for the equipment. I've got to store it or whatever. Well, I hate to tell you this, but you start with step 1, you go to step 2, you go to step 3. If you start stepping over the steps, you're going to have lots of legal troubles at the end of the day if you terminate a contract prematurely, you don't follow those contract formalities. So And you're going to need to give every notice required by the contract and allow the timeframes required by the contract. And last, termination. As we saw before, invoking the surety's obligation under the bond may not require termination, but if it does, you're going to have to do that and follow the contract formalities again. When I have clients come to my office and talk to me about defaulting principals, excuse me, and what their remedies are, the first thing I say to them is, and a lot of times clients come to me and say, I got to get this contractor off my project, or the subcontractor off my project. Just destroying my schedule, just not performing. They don't have people on the project. They don't have competent supervision. They don't have competent workers. You know the litany, the list of all this stuff. Well, the first thing I say to that client or any other client is that termination is the remedy of last resort. Say it again, last resort. It is very difficult to prove, no matter how incompetent you believe the principal is at that time. Time's going to pass until the day of reckoning, the lawsuit or whatever it is. And by the time that time passes, that principal is going to have a lawyer, and they're going to have worked with those witnesses. And guess what? That incompetent contractor or subcontractor is going to look like a world beater in front of an arbitrator or a jury. So you need to be aware of this going in. And I also counsel clients about considering alternative remedies. A lot of contracts, and the IA form is one that has alternative remedies, include a self-help provision. And that allows an obligee to take over some portion of the work and perform it themselves and cure the default. Well, if you can do that and back charge those costs to the defaulting principal, that's a much better remedy for all the stakeholders. Look, the principal's not going to be happy about it. They're going to be claiming, you're taking over my work, you're taking over my means and methods, you're interfering with my work, blah, 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 right? Well, that's a smaller and much more discrete dispute than an overall termination of the contract. Now, exercising that remedy as an alternative to termination really it depends on what work is the genesis of the default. If it's a discrete portion of the project or a discrete item of work, it's easy to carve that out and do that. But if it's not a discrete portion of the work or a discrete portion of the project, and you've got it interspersed all over the place, and it'd be very difficult to manage taking over a portion of the work, then I would probably be disinclined to give guidance to exercise that right. But getting back to what we're talking about here right now is, number one principle here is termination, a remedy of last resort. Consider all of your options before you hit the nuclear button, because that's what it is. And that the self-help option is something to be considered because it keeps the dispute much more manageable. The other thing to remember too is the irony of termination in a delay situation. If you have the irony of termination in a delay situation, the irony of it is that if you exercise the termination right because your project's so delayed and somebody's not performing, well, guess what? You're going to engender more delay because you're going to have to terminate the contract, and if you have conditions to that termination, that's going to delay the project further. And then even once you get to termination, you may have you know, you have to allow this surety some reasonable time to investigate. And then there's all the mechanics of developing a new scope of work, rebidding it, all of this kind of stuff. And so in taking this, when you're sitting around the table and trying to deal with this conundrum of a defaulting principal, all of these factors have to be taken into consideration. And what's the end game?
Then something, I guess, may be obvious to some of you, maybe not. Sureties aren't construction covenants. And so they guarantee a lot of construction, but when they step into a claim, I mean, another slowdown is they're hiring consultants and you know, all kinds of independent third parties to either validate the claim or validate the cost. And that, you know, they don't have a construction group to drop on the ground on your job to figure it out in a day or two and write checks. It doesn't work that way. So it's contributes to the ad.
And that is another good point, is, you know, even though we saw before, one of the options under the AIA form was for the surety to come in and perform itself. Well, that is really rare. I've never seen that happen.
In fact, it goes beyond that, really. You know, the slide that I put up, all those new surety companies, the sureties that you're used to hearing, that you know, that dominate the market, top 5, which is about 90+% of the market, Hartford, Chubb, Travelers, Liberty, those guys all have real legitimate claims operations. A lot of these newcomers that you might be the obligee on a bond from them, they don't have anything. You know, they're farming out, you know, the most basic, you know, legal work and hiring consultants. Whereas, you know, Travelers, they do have they've got attorneys all over the country. They've got consultants and or accountants and financial people on staff in Atlanta. If Travelers is guaranteeing you on a sub bond on your job and you terminate, you know, I can vouch they're gonna move as fast as you know, as possible under the governing restrictions of the forms and the law. But you get one of these other guys that's been in the surety business 2 years and doesn't have any claims infrastructure whatsoever. That's another complication. So you don't want to compound the challenge by, you know, having a bond form that's got all these, you know, steps and delay tactics basically built in.
But again, as Doug said, even the most, the big players in the market, the Travelers and the like, they have accountants, attorneys, and claims departments and all of that. They don't have contractors.
No.
And so when you declare default, they're going to be going out in the marketplace and getting somebody to perform for them. So that's going to take time. And that's sort of the irony that I was talking about. A lot of construction contracts now lay out what is, in fact, a material breach that will be the foundation for, or they can lay the foundation for a declaration of default. The AIA 8201 form is such a document, and you know, you see variations of this in just about every construction contract now. Repeatedly refusing to supply enough properly skilled workers or materials, fails payment to its subcontractors or suppliers, repeatedly disregards applicable laws. And then here's the kicker. Otherwise is guilty of a substantial breach of the provisions of the contract documents. Well, I've been practicing law more than 20 years, and I can't tell you what a substantial breach is. I can sort of tell you what a material breach is, but this is what we're talking about when I was talking about before, deciding what is going to defeat the underlying purpose of the contract. Now, I think the case law is that a substantial breach equals a material breach, but there are cases, and I know in fact in Virginia, that's a lower standard of breach than a material breach. And you may be able to argue that something less than a material breach gives you the obligation to declare a default, terminate the contract. I wouldn't want to be there, but if I had to make that argument, I would. But I think we've all seen this litany or list in, if not an AIA form, a different form of contract, and that's really the first place you look about, do we have a material breach, and are we going to declare default? If you do exercise your rights and invoke the surety's obligations under the contract, or under the bond, the surety has numerous defenses. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because, but you will see in any litigation that ensues from a termination or an attempt to invoke a surety's obligations under a bond, they have all the defenses of their principal. They will certainly scrutinize notice, and if you haven't complied with the contract formalities, number one thing we talked about earlier, you're going to lose. Failure of opportunity to perform, that's not giving them a reasonable opportunity to investigate and do their work, and if it's stated in the bond, that's time prejudice to their rights. Impairment of collateral, if you paid out the contract balance too soon, and lack of good faith on the part of the obligee, that would be making misrepresentations or withholding material information from them during their investigation. So now we're going to turn to the principles and talk about what happens on the other side of this. In one room, we had the obligees talking to one another and saying, or the obligees team saying, we've got a failing principle and we need to do something about it. They've material breached, and we're going to send them notice of material breach and notice of default and start invoking the process. So you open your mail one day, or you open your email, and you get a notice of default. I can't tell you how many times I've talked to people who get notices of default and treat them like they were just any other letter or the napkin that comes with your lunch. And then when their contract gets terminated, everybody gets up in an uproar like, I can't believe you terminated the contract. Well, didn't you see the notice of default 30 days ago or 7 days ago, whatever the time frame is? It happens. And when termination happens, then everybody is in an uproar. That's not the time to get exercised about it. Engage and communicate immediately. There's not a more important thing to do if you're a principal, especially if you're an executive with a principal and you're somewhat detached from the project and don't know what's going on the ground. To reach out to the obligee and say, what's going on here, let's talk about this, because the top priority here, avoid termination, avoid invoking surety obligations.
What if we step back a half a step and said, typically a default notice is going to be preceded by a cure notice, correct? I mean,
Well,
under most contracts?
Actually, that's exactly right.
Where I was going was, if so, that's the point to really get engaged and formally get the cure.
Well, let's just step back, and this may be just a terminology issue we're talking about here. When you get to this point in the project, the tenor of the communications on the project is probably going to be pretty elevated and pretty pointed, and usually this stuff doesn't just happen. There's a history to the issues that lead to a declaration of default. And what I'm talking about is a declaration of default is when you make the declaration, well then there's a cure period.
Okay.
And so you have a notice of default, an opportunity to cure, and then a termination right. And even if I've seen construction contracts that say, if you default, I can terminate. No notice of default, no cure period. Well, I would counsel you to say, to not exercise that right without giving notice of default and giving it a reasonable period to cure. So if you're a principal and you get that notice that says you're in default and you got 7 days to cure, or 7 days to begin your cure and diligently pursue that cure, don't ignore it. Engage and communicate. Take immediate action. And conduct an objective investigation. So what that means is you talk to your people and you talk to their people. Got to review the contract, undertake action to cure. And of course, to preserve your legal rights, you're going to need to write a responsive a letter preserving those rights and asserting any defenses or objections or different countering view to the declaration that you got. But as I said, the top priority is to avoid the termination and avoid invoking surety obligations. A termination, I was talking about termination from the obligee's perspective before, about how it's going to affect that project. It's going to destroy your schedule, it's going to cost you money, it's going to cost all those other things. Well, if you're a principal, it's a nuclear blast on your business. It has the chance to completely destroy your business. Guess what? On all of your bids that were your pre-qualification statements, guess what you're going to have to say? Yes, I didn't finish a project. Yes, I was terminated for default. And guess what that is? That's a scarlet letter. You're not going to get hired anymore. And also, your ability to bond is going to be destroyed, if not, at best, severely limited. And so, all the engage and communicate step is really something to protect your business. Now, as a principal that receives a letter like this, you're not going to say, oh, these guys are right. Let's go out there and do whatever they want, right? You're gonna have the same kind of arguments that we just talked about before. Your contract documents are ambiguous. They don't cover the scope of work. They are defective. You delayed my work by not providing me shop drawing submittals or approvals on time. You haven't provided provided equipment on time. Other types of arguments. You have incompetent or absent project management, on and on and on. Even if that is the case, if you think that that there is a chance of you getting terminated, I would encourage you to perform, even if you dispute the declaration of default. And here's why. You avoid the nuclear weapon exploding on your business, but also you control performance of the cure. You get to cure your own alleged default, right? You control the cost. You minimize the delay of the project, and you can recover the cost in a subsequent claim. Now, sometimes that's a hard sell, because when I have clients in my office talking to me about, I've received this, but I'm not in default. These guys are in default. Well, guess what? They've got the suitcase open and they're about to push the button. And if they do it, even if they're wrong, it's going to have untold circumstances in your business. And so you're in a position, perhaps, of weighing these evils. And if I have had clients where we decided, okay, we're going to take over the cure and we're going to do it ourselves. That way, if we're wrong, if it's unclear, at least we have controlled the cost, we've controlled the delay, and we've avoided termination. And so those are a lot of good things for a principal, but you really have to weigh a lot of factors in doing that. So that's it. Anybody have any questions?
There's a couple things we,
Mark, hey, if you don't have a GC fund,
Right?
and they go away, does the SD, the bonding program still stay with the?
Are you talking about subcontractor default insurance?
Yes.
Well, here, and that sort of frames up the point that I made earlier, is if you are an owner and the general has subcontractor default insurance, the general is the insured. And so if the general goes away,
I think that the short answer is it depends. I mean, it can be, there are a couple of products now that'll endorse the GC into the coverage, or if there's a bond on that GC in your case, then the bonding company can be endorsed as an interested party in the sub-default policy.
If you don't bond the GC,
You don't bond a GC, you've got to bridge it through an endorsement, or you've got to get other kind of performance.
I would say more than likely the owner is got trouble there. They're
More
not
than likely.
insured. They're not an insured in that situation.
so you can also do it, I guess you can modify, maybe the language that they have in that policy.
There's one carrier that will include the owner for the GC's default. XL's got that ability. There's a couple of things I want to just bring your attention to before we wrap up. I know we're running just a little bit long. There's another bond form in your package. It says copy over here on the right. I just bring your attention to that. This is a form that one of my GC clients accepted from a sub, without specifying a bond form. Take a read through it. There's some really bad language in it that makes it almost worthless. And it's an example of what you might get if you don't specify a form.
Which one is that?
It says copy over here. It's got a highlight on it. If you don't have it, I can give you this one. Yeah, it says insurer's indemnity in the left-hand corner. And there's one thing I just wanted to bring your attention to. I skipped over when we went through the slides on SDI, because this is kind of something that is showing up a little bit recently, and we're seeing some inquiries about it on message boards for a surety association that we're involved in. And I had it happen to me. Okay, this is the second bottom bullet point here. There's a trend as, I think more experience has developed under these products and a lot more losses have been incurred, that there's somewhat of a recognition out there that in the past, when you enrolled in the SubGuard program, you didn't give a personal indemnity. Okay, so that was an advantage to you, and I've heard this from subs related to me. Well, I don't mind if they put me in there. I'm not personally guaranteeing that, or I'm personally guaranteeing my surety.
Right.
Well, that's been recognized by the insureds on SubGuard policies, and recently, and I can see this as a trend happening more and more as we go the next 20 years, because baby boom generation is starting to age out of companies, right? When you do a management, in this case, it was a long-time client, long-time in-business company, really good subcontractor. And the retiring owner sold the company to the managers. Well, he took a note back. So it was debt financing technically, right? Well, the surety understands that, and we subordinated the note to the surety for them to continue to bond work. SubGuard insured, going through their underwriting process, they noticed, wait a second, your balance sheet's upside down, you got all this debt now, what's going on? We need to meet. And, you know, because they've got what? $1 million deductible in front, right? So they've got a vested interest in understanding this. So they required that my client give them a personal guarantee. And if you think about it, you've heard this logic before, because we have this discussion all the time with bonding clients with regard to the bank. The surety company tells you, well, if you're not personally guaranteeing the bank, we don't want to be at cross purposes with your bank. Well, the same logic kind of supports doing something, but, you know, reach out to your broker, hopefully it's us, in those kinds of circumstances, because, you know, you can negotiate this. And we were able to negotiate what we all felt like was a pretty reasonable deal. Okay, my client, unlimited guaranteeing and surety, we gave them a $1 limited guarantee on this contract. And it was a percentage of the total. And so, you know, both parties felt like that's reasonable. We're not going to be at cross purposes. The idea being, if the company got in trouble, he doesn't have a personal guarantee to the SubGuard guy. He got a personal guarantee on all the bonded work. So they would try to, you know, protect all the bonded work, potentially at the detriment of unbonded work. And so that's something we're seeing happening more and more. And and as companies go through transitions like we're going to see in the next 20 years, that's probably going to be more likely to be a conversation, because when you do debt financing on those kind of deals, that would raise that question. And then, you know, collateral could also be substituted in there, right? I mean, if you don't want to give a personal guarantee, but you have the ability to post a letter of credit or, you know, a CD or something, that could be an alternative to that. But we wouldn't be shocked to see more of that as time goes by, because I think there's some logic there, just like your surety uses about your bank. They want to have the same. If you're personally guaranteeing the bank, we want to be personally guaranteed. If they've given it up, okay, we can consider giving it up, you know, if you qualify for it. So, any questions on that? I didn't mean to skip over that. We appreciate everybody's attention. I know this ran a little bit long. I saw a lot of nodding heads, and hopefully there was some good stuff in here. It wasn't too boring. We appreciate Mark's time, and I think we've got a drawing here for people that attended. We didn't get business cards.